She thought the boy she saved in that orphanage fire was lost forever, until she knocked on a stranger's door and saw the same wooden rocking horse. What Hannah didn't know, the grieving rancher standing in front of her, was the boy's father, and the child both of them had been searching for was still out there, waiting to come home. If you believe lost families can find their way back, stay with us. The storm had been clawing at the hills since dusk, hurling rain across the winding road like a furious animal, unwilling to release its hold on the night. Hannah Cole pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, each step forward heavy with soaked fabric and stubborn resolve. The wagon she'd hired from town sat broken 3 miles back, a busted axle leaving her stranded and alone in the dark. No driver, no lantern, no choice but to walk. Her boots sank in the mud with every step as she pushed up the rise, heart pounding with exhaustion and fear. Somewhere ahead, if Reverend Carver's directions were true, the Turner Ranch waited. Just for the night, she reminded herself. Only until the rain stopped and the schoolhouse was ready for her to move in. A single oil lamp flickered in the distance, its soft glow bleeding through the fog like a far-off lighthouse. The house rose out of the dark like the back of some sleeping giant. Hannah climbed the porch steps, each one groaning beneath her weight in the rain. Her knuckles rapped against the door just as a crack of thunder split the air. The door opened slower than she expected. A tall, broad-shouldered man filled the frame. Shadows carved sharp lines across his face, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. Dark, cautious, and assessing. "You're lost," he said simply, his voice low and even. Hannah shook her head, forcing her words through cold, numbed lips. "I'm Hannah Cole. Reverend Carver sent me. The schoolhouse isn't ready yet, and he said you might—" She swallowed, embarrassed at the ask. "Have room for just one night." Matthew Turner didn't speak immediately. His gaze drifted past her to the storm still howling at the fields beyond. His jaw tightened like hospitality tasted bitter on his tongue. Finally, he stepped back. "You can come in, but only till morning." Hannah stepped inside, nearly stumbling with relief as the warmth slapped her skin like an old memory she hadn't earned. The smell of cedar smoke drifted from the hearth. Something faint and sweet lingered beneath it. Molasses, maybe, or old pipe tobacco. But it wasn't the scent or even the reluctant man who shut the door behind her that stole her breath. It was the silence. Not peaceful, not restful. Heavy, thick, the kind that settles inside homes where laughter used to live. Her eyes drifted across the room. A rocking chair sat empty by the fireplace. 2 places were set at the dining table but untouched. Near the door, a pair of large men's boots rested beside a single, much smaller child's shoe, worn at the heel and left as if waiting for feet that wouldn't fill them again. "There's a cot in the parlor," Matthew said, already turning down the hall. "It'll have to do." Hannah nodded, too cold and wet to protest. As she followed him, her gaze caught something tucked in the shadows by the corner of the hallway. A small, hand-carved rocking horse, the wood worn smooth by years of use. Her breath hitched. She knew that horse, or one just like it, 5 years ago. A fire, an orphanage swallowed by smoke. A soot-covered boy clinging to a wooden horse just like that. Hannah's heart squeezed so tight she had to steady herself against the wall. "It belonged to my son." Matthew's voice came low from ahead, as if he noticed where she was looking but didn't care to explain further. She turned toward him slowly. You have a child?" The question landed between them like a dropped hammer. "I had a son," he said, and that was all. Hannah said nothing more. Not yet. That night, as she lay on the narrow cot in the parlor, the storm rattling against the walls, sleep stayed out of reach. Every creak in the house felt like a whisper from a life that had collapsed in on itself. Her mind drifted back, flashes of memory, smoke-blackened ceilings, the frantic search for survivors. The small, shaking boy who never spoke, but clung to that wooden horse like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Could it really be the same child? She hadn't known his name. No one had. After the fire, he'd been transferred to foster care in another county. Records lost. Names blurred. But now, here she was, sleeping under the roof of a man who claimed to have lost a son. A man whose house still carried the dust of grief like it belonged here more than any guest ever could. Hannah reached for her satchel and pulled out her worn journal. The last page listed orphanages, dates, half-finished leads she'd never had the heart to pursue fully. Tonight, a door she thought was closed had just cracked open. She didn't know what she believed yet. But she knew one thing for certain. She hadn't come this far just to be dry and warm. Morning came thick with fog, the fields outside wrapped in a pale, wet mist, like cotton batting over the land. Hannah rose early, folded the wool blanket that had kept her warm, and poured water from the pitcher to wash the sleep from her face. Downstairs, the scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Matthew stood at the stove, pouring himself a cup. "There's bread if you're hungry," he said without looking up. "Thank you." She tore off a small piece, chewing in silence as she sat at the far end of the table. Hoofbeats broke the quiet. A wagon pulled up the drive, and moments later a brisk knock rattled the door. Matthew opened it to reveal Reverend Carver, brushing the dust from his overcoat, shaking off the chill like it was an old companion. "I was hoping to find you both up," the Reverend said with a nod toward Hannah. "Miss Cole." "Reverend?" He stepped inside, taking off his hat, eyes shifting quickly between them. "I'm afraid word travels faster than sense in this town," Carver said with a half-smile. "Folks already know you stayed the night here." Hannah's stomach tightened. "It's not your fault," the Reverend continued. "Circumstances being what they were." He paused, as if weighing each word. "But gossip being what it is, there's one way to settle this before it grows into something uglier." Hannah stilled, already guessing what was coming. "A marriage," Carver said gently. "Legal, respectable, no expectations beyond appearances." Matthew crossed his arms, staring out the window. "Let them talk," he muttered. "I'd rather they didn't," Hannah said quietly. "Not if it costs me my position at the school." The Reverend's gaze softened. "Miss Cole." "Hannah, your work matters, and this town has sharp teeth when it wants to." For a long beat, no one said anything. Finally, Matthew spoke, voice low but steady. "I won't ask anything of you, not your cooking, not your name on my land. You'll be free to do as you please." Hannah met his gaze. "And in return, you'll have shelter," he said simply, "and the town will stay out of your way." Her throat tightened. This wasn't her plan. She'd come here for answers, not to bind herself to a grieving stranger. But something in Matthew's eyes, something worn and raw, made her pause. "How soon?" she asked. "By this afternoon, if you like," Carver answered. Hannah swallowed. Slowly, she nodded. Then, before sunset. The ceremony was brief. On the front porch, with nothing but the worn leather Bible, 2 hurried signatures and the soft smell of hay drifting on the breeze. Hannah and Matthew Turner became husband and wife. She wore the same dress she'd arrived in, now dry and brushed clean. Matthew placed a simple silver ring on her finger, its edges softened with time. "Was it hers?" she asked under her breath. He nodded once. "Lydia's." The name settled between them like dust on an undisturbed shelf. When it was done, Matthew offered her the upstairs room instead of the parlor. Hannah accepted, carrying her satchel light in her hand but heavy with questions she wasn't ready to ask. In the quiet hallway, she passed the little rocking horse again. It hadn't moved. Neither had her doubts. But now, she had a place to stay, a name, if not her own. And maybe, just maybe, a way to begin again. The early days of their marriage passed like the fog that settled over the hills, quiet, thin, without clear shape. Hannah rose before sunrise each morning, moving through the house like a shadow. She dusted shelves that hadn't seen a cloth in years. She scrubbed the parlor windows until light could finally cut through. She planted marigolds in a cracked clay pot outside the kitchen door, not because she expected them to grow, but because doing something that hinted at life felt necessary. Matthew didn't stop her. He didn't ask her to either. He spent most of his time in the barn or the pastures, returning only for meals which Hannah prepared in silence. Their conversations were brief, mostly practical. "There's more firewood in the shed. Ground's too wet for planting today." The mare's favoring her front leg. But still something settled between them. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of truce. Yet every room in the house whispered something to her. There was a closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway, always shut, dust gathering along the edges of the floorboards outside it. A faint, worn smudge of a child's handprint lingered on the lower panel. Hannah didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she found herself drawn to the little rocking horse in the hall. Its edges smooth, the wood faded from years of small hands gripping it tight. Late one afternoon, while Matthew was repairing a broken fence post out near the north field, Hannah climbed into the attic with a broom and more determination than she knew what to do with. The air was thick with dust and cedar. Moving aside boxes and blankets, she found a small wooden crate tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt. Inside, children's books, a tin horse toy, a quilt stitched with blue stars, and a single photograph. A young woman with kind, light eyes sat with a small boy perched shyly on her lap. Hannah's heart kicked against her ribs. She turned the photo over. Lydia and Daniel, spring 1875. Daniel. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled as she sat back on her heels. The boy in the photograph looked older than the child she'd pulled from the burning orphanage 5 years ago, but there was something familiar in the eyes, the same quiet watchfulness. She traced the photograph's edge with her thumb. Could it be? She didn't allow herself to believe it yet. Hope was a dangerous thing, more dangerous sometimes than despair. That evening, when Matthew returned, his shirt streaked with dirt and sweat, Hannah set a bowl of stew on the table and sat across from him as dusk softened the edges of the world outside the window. "Was your son quiet?" she asked gently. Matthew's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He didn't look up. "He wasn't loud, if that's what you mean. I mean, with strangers. Did he talk much?" Matthew lowered the spoon. His brow furrowed as though the memory hurt to touch. "He was shy," he said after a long pause. "Only really opened up to Lydia." Hannah nodded, saying nothing more, but inside her chest something shifted. She remembered how the boy she'd saved had clung to her skirt in silence, how he'd followed her from room to room until the authorities came, how, even after being placed with a new family, she'd never quite stopped looking for him. That night, by lamplight, she pulled her journal from the bottom of her trunk and opened it to the section she hadn't dared revisit in years. Her handwritten notes on the fire, descriptions of the orphaned children. There, underlined twice, male, approx 5 years old, dark hair, crescent-shaped birthmark behind right ear, no known family, placed in temporary foster care, Ohio. Hannah closed the book and pressed her palm over it, willing herself not to hope too soon. The next morning, when Matthew left for town, Hannah crouched beside the little rocking horse in the hallway. Running her fingers under its ear, she searched for what she barely dared expect to find. There it was, carved so faintly she had to tilt her head to see it in the light. A single letter, D. Her heart squeezed tight. Later that day, she sat at the small writing desk by the window in her room and drafted a letter to the orphanage in Harrisburg. Her hand trembled as she folded the paper. She signed it, Hannah Turner. The name felt foreign still, like wearing a borrowed coat, but it served its purpose now. 2 days later, as the late summer heat settled thick over the ranch, Matthew approached her after breakfast with an unusual question. "Do you want to come into town with me?" Hannah blinked. Not a request, more like an invitation without expectation. "Yes," she said, standing quickly before she could second-guess herself. The wagon ride into Ashbury passed in companionable silence. The air smelled of dust and hay, and the wide prairie stretched endlessly on either side of them. At the general store, Hannah caught the glances. Mrs. Parker nodded toward her, a mix of curiosity and cautious approval. Mr. Higgins, the farrier, tipped his hat. Children whispered near the barrel of apples by the door. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it also wasn't hostility. Reverend Carver met them outside the church. "How are things at the ranch?" he asked with a smile that said he already knew more than he let on. "Peaceful," Hannah answered. Matthew added, "She's made the place almost livable." It was the first thing resembling a compliment he'd offered her. Hannah blinked at him, surprised. He didn't look back. On the way home, as the wagon creaked over the uneven path, Hannah dared to ask the question that had been resting on her tongue for days. "Do you talk about your wife often?" Matthew kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "No," he said simply. "I'm sorry." He shifted in his seat. "Emma died trying to save Daniel. They told me it was quick, but I'll never know for sure." Hannah's throat tightened. "You weren't there. I was in Charleston selling livestock, trying to get us out of debt." He let out a bitter breath. "I thought they'd be safe." Hannah turned her face slightly toward the fields, letting her hair shield her expression. The fire, the boy, the missing records. The threads began to tangle together in her mind. That night, a sealed letter arrived from Harrisburg. Hannah waited until Matthew had gone to bed. The house dipped in quiet shadows before opening it at the kitchen table. Her hands shook as she unfolded the page. Yes, it read, "We remember the boy. Transferred to a temporary home in Ohio. No known surname. Listed as William. Noted. Crescent-shaped birthmark behind right ear." Hannah pressed the letter to her chest. She didn't sleep that night. By morning she knew what she had to do. But she didn't yet know how to tell Matthew, not without breaking open a heart that had barely begun to mend. The morning broke warm and heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Hannah stood at the fence line, watching Matthew work in the distance. His shoulders moved with the familiar rhythm of mending a busted gate, but something about the way he paused every few minutes, rolling his injured right shoulder, told her more than words could. The letter from Harrisburg sat folded tight in the pocket of her apron, warm against her hip from where she'd touched it, and reread it through the night. She hadn't told him yet, not because she feared his anger. Matthew Turner wasn't a man who raised his voice. No, it was something quieter she feared. What hope might awaken in him, and what might happen if that hope was broken again. Inside the house, she slipped the letter into her journal, tucking it deep beneath pages filled with years of questions and dead ends. Then she returned to the porch with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, expecting that before long, Matthew would come inside needing it. An hour passed before he finally limped up the path, his shirt damp with sweat, his face set with stubborn fatigue. "You favor that shoulder more than usual," she said softly, holding the cloth out to him. "Fence post was more stubborn than I am," he muttered, sitting on the edge of the steps. Hannah knelt beside him, dipping the cloth in the basin, wringing it out with slow, deliberate hands. She waited for a lull in the moment, then spoke. "Did Daniel ever get sick easily?" Matthew's head turned slightly, surprise flickering across his face. "He was always catching something," he said after a pause. "Emma used to say he'd grow into his lungs eventually." Hannah nodded. "Did he have any birthmarks?" Matthew's brows pulled together. Behind his right ear, crescent-shaped, like a half-moon. Her heart squeezed. She rested her hands on her knees, took one slow, steadying breath, and met his eyes. "Matthew, I think I know where your son is." The air went still between them. Even the cicadas seemed to pause in the trees. Matthew lowered the cloth to his lap, his gaze narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Hannah swallowed. "I didn't come to Ashbury by accident." And then, carefully, slowly, she told him everything. The orphanage fire near Harrisburg. The little boy with dark hair and wide, terrified eyes who hadn't spoken for days afterward. The rocking horse he clung to, even when soot covered his face and lungs. How she'd carried him out of the building, wrapped in her coat. How, days later, the system had scattered him to foster care in another state. "I've been looking for him ever since," she finished, her voice steady but low. "And when I saw your rocking horse, I started to wonder. Then I wrote to Harrisburg, and the letter came back yesterday." She pulled it from her apron and placed it carefully in his hands. Matthew's eyes moved over the words, slow and careful, like a man reading something in a language long forgotten but deeply felt. When he finished, he pressed his thumb against the paper as if testing whether it was real. "You should have told me sooner," he said finally, his voice rough. "I wanted to be sure." She swallowed. "I didn't want to give you hope if there wasn't any." He stood then, walking a few paces toward the yard. His back was tense, the set of his shoulders betraying the storm inside him. When he turned, his eyes were raw and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Hope's a dangerous thing to take away from a man who's already buried his heart once. "I know," she whispered. They stood there, the space between them charged and heavy. After a long moment, Matthew gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I have to find him." The next 2 days passed in a quiet, urgent blur. Matthew arranged for Micah, one of his ranch hands, to tend the animals while they were gone. Hannah packed a small trunk with only what was necessary. Clothes, her journal, the letter from Harrisburg. They would travel by rail to Columbus, Ohio, then by hired cart to a farm on the outskirts of the city, the home of the Carters, the Foster family listed in the orphanage records. The night before they left, Hannah walked past the closed door at the end of the hall, the one with the faded handprint. and paused. For the first time since arriving, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was small, with pale blue walls and a quilt neatly folded at the foot of the bed. Dust floated in the air like old memories suspended mid-flight. On a shelf above the desk sat a row of children's books, their spines leaning against each other for support. She reached for the smallest one. Inside the cover, written in uneven child's handwriting, was a name: Daniel Turner. Her throat tightened. As she turned to leave, she found Matthew standing in the doorway. "I haven't been in here since the fire," he said softly. Hannah stepped aside, giving him space. He entered slowly, like a man crossing a river with unsteady footing. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the quilt. "I used to read him to sleep in here," he murmured. He always asked for the same story, about the lost dog who found his way home. Hannah crossed the room and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "If he is your son," she said, "he's not lost anymore." Matthew nodded, though his eyes never left the room. "We leave at first light." The train carved through the West Virginia hills like a blade slicing through mist. Hannah sat by the window, her gloved hands clenched in her lap, watching the world blur past in shades of green and gray. Across from her, Matthew sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight with something unspoken. They barely spoke the entire ride, not from distance, but from the weight of what waited at the other end. After a long stretch of silence, Hannah finally said, "You don't have to say anything, but I want you to know, if this doesn't go how we hope, I'm still glad we're doing it." Matthew didn't look at her right away. When he did, there was something softer, tired but honest in his eyes. "I've imagined this moment for 5 years," he said quietly, "over and over. And every time, I still didn't believe it could be real." Hannah's smile was faint but steady. "Hope is a hard thing to kill. You've been carrying more of it than I have," he said, almost like a confession. They rode the rest of the way in thoughtful quiet. By late afternoon, they reached Columbus and hired a driver with a buckboard to take them to the Carter farm, a modest spread of land sitting at the edge of a wheat field. Laundry danced on a line in the breeze. A boy stacked firewood near the barn, his dark hair damp with sweat, his movements focused and practiced. At the sound of the wagon, the boy turned slightly toward them. Hannah's breath caught. Matthew didn't move. Mr. Carter set down the hoe he'd been sharpening and stepped forward. "Can I help you?" Hannah climbed down first. "My name is Hannah Turner. This is my husband, Matthew." The Carters exchanged glances. "We've come from Ashbury," Matthew said, stepping down from the wagon. His voice was low but steady. "We believe you may be caring for a child who belongs to me." Mrs. Carter came forward, wiping her hands on her apron, her brows knitted with sudden worry. "You mean William?" "His name," Matthew said, "is Daniel Turner." The boy stood frozen near the woodpile, his small hands clenched at his sides. "We were told he had no family," Mr. Carter said cautiously. "I know," Hannah replied gently, "but we've traced his transfer, the birthmark, his age, his silence after the fire. It all lines up." Mrs. Carter's gaze flicked between Hannah, Matthew, and the boy. Her face shifted, caught somewhere between fear and heartbreak. "He's a good boy," she said softly. "Quiet, smart, but we always knew. He wasn't really ours." Matthew took a careful step toward the boy, then another, and then he crouched, lowering himself until he was eye level with him. "Do you remember a rocking horse?" Matthew's voice cracked, but he pressed on. "Made of oak, with your name carved under the ear?" The boy's eyes widened just slightly. Matthew continued, his voice shaking now. "Do you remember a woman named Lydia? She used to sing you a song about starlight and rivers." For a moment there was nothing but the rustle of wheat in the wind. Then, quiet as a breath, the boy whispered, "She smelled like lilacs." Matthew's throat worked, but no sound came out. The boy's gaze shifted to Hannah. "Who are you?" Hannah knelt beside Matthew, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "My name is Hannah," she said softly. "I was there the night of the fire. I pulled you out." The boy blinked, long and slow. "I remember you," he said. Tears stung at the corners of Matthew's eyes, but he blinked them back. "You were always my son," he whispered. "Even when they told me you were gone, I never stopped thinking about you. Not one day." The boy looked down at his hands, then whispered something that made Hannah's heart ache. I used to dream about you, but I thought you were made up. Matthew reached out, placing a hand on the boy's small shoulder. I'm real, son, he said, and I'd like to take you home. The boy didn't pull away. Mrs. Carter wiped at her eyes. He's always belonged to someone, she said. We just held the space for you. That night, Hannah and Matthew stayed in a spare room at the Carter farm. When the oil lamp flickered low and the house finally grew quiet, Matthew spoke into the dark. I don't know how to be a father to him anymore. From her small bed across the room, Hannah answered softly, You already are. The journey back to Ashbury was quieter than Hannah expected, but not empty. Daniel rode beside Matthew on the wagon seat, his small hands clenched tight around the leather strap that ran across the front. Every so often he'd steal glances at Matthew when he thought no one noticed, studying the shape of the man's hands on the reins, the way he clicked his tongue to urge the horses forward. Matthew didn't speak much either, except to ask now and then if Daniel was cold or hungry or needed to stop. The boy only answered with small nods or brief murmurs. It wasn't rejection. It was distance, the kind that grew in a heart trained not to expect permanence. When they reached the ranch, Micah was already waiting at the gate, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting against the afternoon sun. Well, I'll be, he said, stepping forward as Matthew helped Daniel down from the wagon. Looks like you've got company. Matthew's voice dropped low and steady. This is Daniel. He paused. My son. Micah nodded, clapping Matthew lightly on the back. Glad you're home, kid, he said, giving Daniel a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. Daniel looked away, but he didn't bolt. Inside the house, Hannah led the boy upstairs to the room that had once been his. Nothing had changed. The quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. The row of children's books sat waiting on the shelf, their spines leaning against one another like they'd spent years holding each other upright. The small tin horse rested on the windowsill, dulled by time but present all the same. Daniel stood in the doorway, staring at it all with wide, unreadable eyes. You can sit if you want, Hannah said gently. He didn't respond. She crouched beside him, her voice soft but steady. This was your room once, she said. I know it doesn't feel like it yet, but it's yours. His gaze moved to the bookshelf. Did you put those there? She shook her head. Your mother did. Daniel's eyes dropped to the floor. Do you miss her? He asked, so quietly she almost missed it. Hannah's throat tightened. I didn't know her, she said honestly, but I think about her, especially now. Daniel took a step inside and sat on the edge of the bed, curling his small hands around the quilt. Downstairs, Matthew paced in the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck like a man lost inside his own house. He doesn't say much, he muttered when Hannah came down. He will, she said. Give him time. I don't know what to say to him, Matthew admitted, leaning against the counter. I feel like a stranger. For now, you are. She offered him a small, reassuring smile. But you're also the safest place he's had in years. He just doesn't know that yet. Matthew's gaze dropped to the floor. I keep thinking about all the years I missed, all the things I should have done. I'm terrified I won't know how to be what he needs. Hannah placed her hand gently on his arm. You already are, she said. You brought him home. That night, they sat at the dinner table, the three of them, for the first time. Hannah served stew, placing carrots carefully at the edge of Daniel's bowl. The boy picked at them, glancing at Matthew when he thought no one was watching. Hannah pretended not to notice, giving them both the quiet space to find their footing. After the meal, she stepped onto the porch, listening to the night sounds return to their familiar rhythms. Through the open window, she heard faint footsteps upstairs and the low murmur of Matthew's voice, telling his son about the horses, the land, and how the river behind the house flooded every spring. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Days passed. Routine settled in, slow and careful. Hannah returned to her duties at the schoolhouse. Matthew stayed close to home, involving Daniel in small tasks, feeding the hens, brushing the horses, collecting kindling for the stove. The boy rarely spoke, but he didn't shy from Matthew's presence. Instead, he watched, observed, mirrored. One afternoon, Hannah came home from town and found the house empty. Panic rose in her chest until she heard laughter, light and unexpected, floating from behind the barn. Following the sound, she stopped short at the sight before her. Daniel stood barefoot by the stream, sleeves rolled up, splashing water toward Matthew, who pretended to grumble but didn't bother to hide his grin. It was the first time she'd seen the boy smile, a real, unguarded smile. She didn't interrupt. She stood and watched, letting the warmth in her chest overtake the fear that had lived there for days. But peace, like autumn, never stayed long. A week later, while Hannah was sorting books for the school's winter term, she overheard two women whispering by the church steps. Is it true she married him just to cover a scandal? I heard the boy isn't even his. Some child she dragged in from somewhere else. Hannah froze, the words landing like stones. She waited until the women moved on before returning to her wagon, keeping her face neutral until she was well out of sight. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the fields, Matthew came into the kitchen with a furrowed brow. I saw Reverend Carver today, he said, wiping his hands on a towel. He heard there's talk starting again, about us, about Daniel. Hannah set down the cloth she'd been folding. I heard it too. Matthew exhaled hard through his nose. I want to make something clear, he said, voice low and steady. To the town, to him, to you. She waited. I didn't just marry you to protect your name, and you didn't just bring my son back, you brought me back. Hannah's heart stilled. I know we didn't begin this like other people do, Matthew continued, stepping closer, but I'd like to begin now, if you're willing. Her throat tightened, but her voice stayed steady. I didn't stay for safety, Matthew, she said quietly. I stayed because all of this, feels like a life I want to live in. Before either could say more, a small voice floated from the hallway. Papa? Matthew turned. Coming, son. In that single word, son. Something shifted in the room. Something settled. This wasn't just the middle of a story anymore. It was the beginning of a family. The leaves turned slowly that October, burning gold and copper across the trees lining the back fields. Mornings came cool and crisp. Hannah lit the stove before sunrise to keep the chill from settling too deep into the house. Daniel started waking early, too, padding softly down the stairs in his wool socks. He didn't speak much, not in full sentences, but he hummed sometimes, little wordless tunes under his breath while helping Hannah knead bread or when brushing down the horses with Matthew. One night at dinner, he startled them both by setting down his fork mid-bite and saying, I remember the dog story. Matthew nearly dropped his spoon. Hannah froze, her heart caught somewhere between surprise and hope. Which one? Matthew asked softly. The lost dog, Daniel said. The one that kept trying to find his way home, even when the trail got cold. Matthew's voice was raw when he answered. That was your favorite. Daniel nodded. You always did the voices. Matthew let out a soft, choked laugh. I still can, he said. That night, by firelight, Matthew pulled the old storybook from the shelf and read aloud, his voice a little shaky at first, then growing stronger with each page. Daniel curled up against Hannah's side, his eyes drifting closed, the edges of a smile lingering on his lips. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel so hollow. But just as their fragile peace began to take root, another storm started to gather. 2 mornings later, as Matthew finished shoeing a restless colt, Sheriff Delaney rode up to the ranch, his expression grim. Afternoon, Matthew, the sheriff said, swinging off his horse with a heavy grunt. Matthew wiped sweat from his brow. What's the trouble? Delaney removed his hat. Word reached us from Ohio, some kin of the Carters. Mrs. Carter's brother has shown up, asking questions, says he's got legal guardianship papers, claims blood rights. Matthew's face went still. He's filing in court, the sheriff continued. Wants to challenge your custody. Matthew's jaw tightened. He's not their blood either. I know that, but legal papers and loud men make trouble, even when they're wrong. The air between them thickened. I thought this was settled, Matthew said quietly. Delaney shrugged. The world don't always care about the truth, Matthew. Sometimes it only cares about what's written on paper. When Hannah returned from the schoolhouse that evening, Matthew told her everything. They sat together at the kitchen table, lamplight pooling between them, their hands resting side by side on the scarred wood. They want to take him, Matthew said bitterly, or at least make enough noise to scare us. Hannah didn't flinch. Then we make more noise. Matthew blinked at her. You really think we can fight this? She nodded. We have Reverend Carver. We have the orphanage records. We have your name, and we have the truth." Matthew reached into the coat hanging on the wall and pulled out the photograph of Lydia and Daniel, the one Hannah had found in the attic. He placed it in her hands. "Keep this close," he said softly. "If anything happens—" "Nothing will happen," she interrupted. "We're going to protect him. Together." And in that dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by worn walls and second chances, Hannah and Matthew Turner prepared for the fight of their lives. The courtroom in Ashbury wasn't much more than a repurposed meeting hall behind the sheriff's office with creaky wooden benches and sun-bleached curtains that didn't quite cover the windows. But that morning, it felt like the center of the world. Every seat was filled. Hannah sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her back straight as if posture alone could keep her from coming undone. Matthew stood at the table with Reverend Carver, both men looking tired but resolved. Daniel sat between Hannah and Micah, his small tin horse clutched tight in both hands. His feet didn't quite touch the floor, but he sat still, shoulders squared like he understood more than anyone wanted him to. Across the room sat Gregory Ames, Mrs. Carter's brother, a tall man with a sharp mustache and a voice that slithered more than it spoke. He wore a tailored coat too fine for Ashbury and a smile too polished to trust. Judge Harlan, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a face carved with years of stern decisions, thumbed slowly through the papers in front of her. When she finally looked up, the room went still. "Mr. Ames," she said, her voice steady, "you are not this boy's blood relative. Your claim rests solely on your late sister's temporary guardianship. What proof do you have that this child would be better off in your care?" Gregory rose, straightening his lapels like he was about to deliver a sermon. "Your Honor," he began with false charm, "I have stable employment, an estate in Cincinnati, and no record of financial distress. I also have concerns about the current guardianship resting on informal ties, unbacked by proper documentation, a marriage of convenience. Emotional claims, no legal adoption process." A ripple of disapproval moved through the room. Matthew didn't flinch. Judge Harlan turned to Hannah. "Mrs. Turner, you're the one who rescued the child from the Harrisburg fire?" Hannah stood, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, Your Honor. I was volunteering at a clinic nearby when the fire broke out. I carried him out myself. He was 5 years old, covered in soot. Couldn't speak for 3 days. Did you know his name at the time?" "No, ma'am. But he had a toy horse with a carving under its ear." Hannah's voice steadied. "And when I arrived in Ashbury and saw a near-identical rocking horse at Mr. Turner's home, I began connecting the dots." She reached into her bag and placed the photograph of Lydia and Daniel on the judge's desk. This was taken months before the fire. Judge Harlan studied the photo carefully, then turned to Gregory. "What say you to this?" Gregory shrugged, offering a hollow smile. "Photos can resemble many children, Your Honor. Grief makes good people see what they wish were true." Reverend Carver rose next. "I baptized Daniel myself," he said, voice low but certain. "I remember his birth, his eyes, his quiet nature. That boy sitting there today is Daniel Turner." Silence fell like a blanket across the room. Then Judge Harlan's gaze shifted to Daniel. "Noah," she started, then caught herself and smiled gently. "Daniel, would you like to speak?" Hannah felt her stomach twist. Matthew's shoulders stiffened. Daniel sat frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, he set down his tin horse and stood. "I remember the fire," he said, voice soft but clear enough to carry. "I remember her," he pointed to Hannah, "pulling me out." Gasps sounded from the benches behind them. "I didn't talk for a long time," Daniel continued. "I forgot things, but I remember my mama's song. And a story about a dog who kept trying to find his way home." He turned then, looking directly at Gregory. "You don't know that story." Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his chair, color draining from his face. The judge's pen paused over her paper. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her tone softening. The boy sat back down between Hannah and Micah, clutching his tin horse once again, but now with hands that trembled less. Judge Harlan straightened her papers, then glanced over the room, her gaze sharp and sweeping. "This court sees no compelling evidence to remove this child from the only consistent home and parental figures he's known. Emotional ties matter. Stability matters. Blood, while important, is not everything. She paused. This court recognizes Matthew and Hannah Turner as the lawful guardians of Daniel Turner. The breath Hannah had been holding for what felt like days finally escaped her chest. Matthew's shoulders sagged in relief. Across the room, Reverend Carver offered a nod of quiet victory. Micah let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath, earning a sharp elbow from the woman sitting next to him. Matthew turned toward Daniel and placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. And just like that, it was done. Outside, the spring sun broke through low clouds, warming the air with something that felt like promise. As they exited the building, people stepped back to give them space, but many offered quiet congratulations. Micah clapped Matthew on the back. "Told you justice still breathes in this town." Reverend Carver tipped his hat to Hannah. "I've seen many miracles," he said with a soft smile. "But this one was forged by grace and grit." The wagon ride home was slow and peaceful. Halfway there, Daniel leaned forward and touched the reins. "Can I try?" Matthew blinked, then smiled. The kind of smile that started in the eyes before reaching the mouth. "Easy now," he said, handing over the leather straps. "Just guide her gentle." Daniel's grin stretched wide and unguarded, like sunlight breaking through after a long winter. Hannah watched them both, her heart full to bursting. That evening back at the ranch, Hannah stood on the porch as Matthew and Daniel led the horse into the barn. She watched the way they moved together, the space between them smaller now, the distance that had once felt endless now nearly closed. Later, over dinner, Daniel set down his fork and looked between them, his face thoughtful. "Do I have to call you Mrs. Turner forever?" he asked, eyes fixed on Hannah. She blinked, caught off guard. "You can call me whatever you're comfortable with," she said gently. Daniel seemed to consider that, then smiled. A quiet, knowing smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I think I'll call you Ma." Hannah's throat tightened, her vision blurring for just a second. Matthew reached across the table and took her hand in his, giving it a soft, steady squeeze. In that small, perfect moment, surrounded by lamplight and stew and soft laughter, the three of them sat together at the same table, no longer bound by loss or duty alone, but by something deeper: family. The world outside, wide and unpredictable as it was, would have to wait. For now, they were home.